This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft. Because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story.
Yep. To continue our conversation on time.
Right.
What about when you start in the middle?
Well, it's what Alida said, and I would completely agree with her. It was stunning what she revealed.
Welcome to this week's Storyworks Roundtable. Today, Kathryn, Robert, and I are talking about in media res, or beginning in the middle. So actually, in media res means opening in the middle of dramatic action, as opposed with an opening shot that establishes setting and mood and does world building and introduces characters. So it's jumping right into the action and then bringing everybody up to speed on the who, what, when, and where as the story progresses. And Robert, you suggested this topic for us, so I'm going to let you bring us deeper into it.
Thanks. It's something I really like because I think I like to write that way as well. And you do get some readers who struggle with it. So I know it doesn't work for everybody because it depends what style of story you like reading. If you like fast-paced stories, then beginning in a fairly sizable in media res can work well because you swept up into the action. But it does take, I think, some care because when as an author, I'll come back to the reader experience in a minute, but as an author, you're often got way more going on in your head than you can get in writing. And so, I know where this house is, and I know where that car came from, and I know what that strange sound is back in the in the basement, and so that all seems very exciting to me. But if you don't give quite enough, then that can be the reader just finds himself clueless. And the reason this could be a problem is if they're deciding whether to buy the book or not. And online these days we have the capacity to look at samples. They may just read the first page or two and get utterly confused.
Right.
So the idea of in media res is that you start where things are already happening.
Yes.
So that you don't have to do lots of explaining work. And in today's culture, I think we're much more used to things happening with opening action sequences. Right now, in media res doesn't necessarily mean you have to have action, guns and fighting, but it's the easiest way. It's the easiest example to give. And it probably started in the old classic James Bond era, where the opening sequence would always be him, escaping or finishing up his very last mission, so he'd have to go back and apologise to M. But nowadays, if you look at any of the superhero movies, I mean, they don't start with, Captain America sort of opening the door and saying, "Hi, honey, I'm home." It's these things start in the middle of stuff to swoop you in.
Right. Well,
now, that can be action sequence, but it can equally be emotional. Her words kicked me in the stomach like I've been, stabbed. That could be your opening sequence, your opening sentence. So the reader's got no idea. It's a hooky sentence. It also is in the middle of action. It isn't saying, we'd been married for 7 years when everything started to fall apart. But that's equally valid way to start. So to me, that's the difference. Is being, I don't know if I'm explaining it very well at all, but as a reader, I enjoy it personally. But I know that that's not every style. Some like to be tempted and coaxed and drawn in, and if things start to in too much action, they struggle to build the world in their own head. So it is tricky to do.
It is tricky to do, and it dates back at least to the classic Greeks, opening in media res as opposed to ab ovo, from the egg, from the very beginning of things. And, I think there's an important distinction to make between opening in the middle of your dramatic action of your story and opening with a prologue. If you think of Star Wars, you open with Darth Vader boarding the ship, killing a bunch of guards, and capturing Princess Leia. That is really a prologue. And then we go to Luke Skywalker. So it's a great opening hook. But then we go meet Luke Skywalker on the farm. We see what his life is like, right? There's our chapter 1. And then the aunt and uncle die. Indiana Jones. You open with him at that temple, going through all of the booby traps and nearly losing his life, and then having the other treasure hunter take the treasure right out of his hands. And then you go back to the classroom. I mean, you're going forward in time chronologically. There's no jump. So we're opening with huge hooky action there, but it's not the middle of the action of Raiders of the Lost Ark, right? It's kind of separate. It's its own little encapsulated opening hook, you know? So I think you use the example, Robert, of opening with the couple fighting instead of opening with their wedding day, right? So that's a great example of in media res. We're already in the thick of our dramatic tension for that story.
Yeah. Yeah, the story has already started. Is I suppose is the best way to put it. We're already some way into the story, but not so far you'll be confused, and not so far that you miss important elements of the story that you want to deliver. Now, having said that, some of the exceptions, there are always exceptions to these. You know, you could have a story start where the inciting incident is actually off the page, and it's related in flashback. But that's, to me, those are exceptions. You know, that's deft writing there. To be able to get away with doing that, and then you've got the other one where in a thriller where they pull forward, they got Fight Club, for example, you know, where the end is actually the opening, but it's a framing device. Right, a framing device, yeah. So, you know, that isn't what we mean by in media res. It was not what I mean anyway. That's a different thing. You're putting forward part of the actual climax. So in media res is just simply you're plunged into the story, and it may be emotive, it may be action oriented, but you're just plunged into the story. There's no setup. There's no, you know, the 3 months prior. It starts. The story has already started. I think that's the best way to think about it. Yes. Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it, Robert, that the story has already started. You know, another example, maybe too similar to the couple fighting, but if you're telling a story of somebody who has cancer, you might open with them sitting in the chair at the clinic receiving the chemo drugs, instead of opening with the diagnosis or opening when they first have symptoms and start wondering what's wrong with them, right? So we're already there in the middle of the cancer. And then the story moves forward, but as it moves forward, we can backfill some of those pertinent details of like getting the diagnosis or having the symptoms turn up, right? Without telling all of that story, just giving us those moments that inform the forward movement of the main story. This is it, isn't it? Yeah, the forward movement, the momentum. You know, you would know it, Alida, as a professional editor, that it's often the case that when you're editing somebody else's work, you can say, you know what, you could start on chapter 3 and it will be fine. Because I think we all tend to have, that's too broad. It's common to find a throat clearing, you know, where a huge chunk of the start of your first draft might just be you getting to the story. Right. And so that's why we often say, you know, cut out the first swathe of it. And it's not necessarily just because you want to start in media res, but it's because those first 2 chapters just don't matter to the story. They're the way you've got to it in your own head. It's like the sculptor bringing in the big piece of marble and starting to hack away until they realize what the form that they're really going for of the, you know, the boy kicking the ball or whatever it is that they're doing. So I think, you know, where do you want to start? Do you want to start showing the reader that, you know, unhewn block of stone, or do you want to show the shape already partly disrobed? And that's obviously a story choice. And as I say, I think it's even though practice that dates back to the Greeks. I think if you read older literature, you'll find it starts in general much more slowly, I think, than today's literature. I think we've become a very fast-paced society, so people kind of expect not to have to wait too long before something happens in the story.
Right. Well, and pacing is a separate issue from whether you open in media res or not, because you might open with an introductory establishing scene or chapter or two, but we expect the inciting incident to happen early. And depending on your genre, a lot of books open with a big dramatic hook, and so the hook might be in the form of a prologue, or it might be in the form of a very early tense inciting incident, or whatever that opening is. I think that's what we expect, and the key is to make it all work together, so everything is relevant. If Darth Vader went and kidnapped Joe Space Guy instead of Princess Leia, right, it wouldn't be relevant to Luke and Han. So we need everything to come together. We need Leia's droids to end up on Luke's farm. We need all of these elements to flow into that one story. Right. So
I think it's why you end up rewriting the start of your book so much more than any other parts as well, is because you're getting all those moving parts right. If you're passionate about, as I am, obviously, about starting, when the story's already underway, there are a lot of parts to pull together, and you don't want to confuse people, but you want to give enough information that it gets you hooked in, but not too much that it slows it down. And so it's the combination of the pacing element and where am I in the story.
Okay. I guess I'm a little confused.
Okay, good. Good.
When I think of in media res, I think about the stories that start in the middle of the story and then backtrack and then go forward again. Like recently, because I have a 2-year-old, we've been watching The Emperor's New Groove, which starts.
Oh, that's such a cute story. I love that story.
Right? And he tells you, I'm the victim here. And then it goes back and it shows you how he became a llama. And then it goes forward from there. So is that not the same? I mean, that's a different kind of a thing then?
Right. I would say that's more of a framing device. Yeah. It's when so one of my current works in progress opens with a prologue that actually shows a piece of the climax. So that scene that the reader gets, the reader doesn't know when in time it is. And then we go to chapter 1 and we've jumped back a number of years. And then we move forward back to meeting up again with that scene, And so The Emperor's New Groove being filmed, you don't see like chapter breaks. You don't see of those physical breaks there. But I think when I think of in media res, I think of starting with a key event already underway. So like Hamlet's father is already dead. We don't see the king get assassinated. We open with, whoa, turmoil, aftermath, now what? And then the story goes forward.
Okay. There you go. So I had that element all confused in my own brain. So.
Yeah. I mean, I think if the emperor were already a llama and he stayed a llama for the rest of the story, dealing with his llamaness, and then we learned about who he was as the emperor through dialogue, through flashback, through bits of narrative exposition, then it would be opening in media res.
Okay. So that was more of like a structural framing device choice rather than a actual like in media res decision. Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, it's kind of like, it's been years since I watched that movie, but I did watch it a lot when I was when I was watching it. But he has kind of a storyteller quality, if I'm remembering correctly, right? The llama's like, oh my God, can you believe what happened to me? And then it's kind of like the Princess Bride that Robert mentioned maybe in the last episode about time, where the boy and his grandfather are like, hey, wait, the story, right? And then we're off in the story. So the llama's a framing device / storyteller type of figure.
And I guess that happens a lot in modern television and stuff too. A lot of your procedural shows will start with, something happens and then 48 hours earlier and you have to work your way back to which drives me crazy, but separate from that, it's a little different feel to it, right? It feels more like a ploy to get you into the story rather than starting in the middle of an action scene would. Right.
And those stories definitely mess with the timeline. They are playing with chronology to jump you back and forth to make you do the piecing together work, which can be fun or can make you crazy, right? But I think that's a distinct device from simply in media res. In media res is like you take the reader and you just throw them into the story and they get to figure out that kind of introductory stuff that we normally expect to come in the opening scenes.
Yes.
So all the introductory stuff has to be woven in a very different manner than if you were just presenting it.
Yes.
At the beginning.
Yeah, which, if you look at some of the classic fantasy stories, for example, that often doesn't happen. You get quite a bit of scene setting, which is something that fantasy readers quite like. So when you read a fantasy book that starts in action, sometimes that can be a bit disconcerting. Go, wait, what is this world? What are the magic rules? Who's ruling here? Are we in a castle or are we out in a village somewhere? What's going on? So I think there are some genre dependencies in there. But probably the easiest way, I think, to think about it, given just thinking about what you're talking about with TV and movies, it's an easy analogy. It's as if you're waiting for a show to start. You went to the kitchen to make yourself a tea or a coffee, and then you came in and it was already underway, and you had to kind of figure out what was going on because you missed the first couple of minutes. Right?
Yeah.
So it's kind of like that, So there's no establishing here. It's happening.
Right.
And now there is establishing because the author is wisely dripping things in because otherwise it's too confusing. You go, what? Who's she? What are they doing? Why are they here? So, but in to me, the in media res is deliberately provoking those questions to keep the reader wanting to know what happens next. Because why are they doing this? What's happening next? Well, I'm confused. And then all of a sudden, okay, I'm not confused. Now I know, okay, he's trying to walk out on her. Oh, okay, right. But she's pregnant. So, it's things unfold.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes. I'm going to do something really horrible here because I can't remember the name of the book or the author's name, but you both read so much fantasy. Maybe you know what I'm talking about, but, Nico Tarnowski, my friend who was on the show to talk about epic fantasy. Little plug for Nico in that episode. Referred me to a book or gave me a book where it opens with this man. It's clearly fantasy. It's a forest. It's a different world. He's in leggings and leather knee-high boots. And so you get enough description to place yourself with this man in this forest setting, and he is running for his life, and there are soldiers, giants, trolls, whatever, coming after him and arrows flying past his head. So right away you're kind of like the Indiana Jones opening. You're in this life or death situation, and he ends up leaping off a cliff, right? But unlike Indiana Jones, the story continues from there, right? Yep. So we don't go okay, and now we're going to go do over and have a whole new mission. We're going to go introduce you to this guy in the classroom and start a new mission. he lands, he deals with his wounds, and he gets up. And we as readers are thinking, why are these guys chasing him? What has he done? Has he done a good thing or a bad thing? Who's after him? And so there's all of this intrigue in that moment, and it's not spoon-fed to you. There isn't a narrative of like, meet this person, meet this world, meet this conflict. You get the conflict. And then you have to read on for things to unfold and become clear. So hopefully that's not too terrible of an example from my foggy memory here.
I want to read it.
I'm sure I can find it on my Kindle and we can put it in the show notes. Right.
Sounds interesting. See, you already done it. You started in media res. We didn't even have to know what the book was, what the title is,
or who the author is, or anything.
We already want to read it.
Yes.
But maybe that's a clue there as well. What you said is that there's already conflict.
Mm-hmm.
So perhaps that's there's already conflict. There's already friction. So it's very simplistic to say, well, the story's already started, but that means we're already dealing with some conflict or some issue.
Right. And if you think back to, Hamlet, the king is already dead. We don't need to see the king assassinated. This is Hamlet's story, not the king's story.
Yeah.
So we don't need to open with that. We can open in the aftermath. We can open in the trauma. We can open with the treatment underway instead of the diagnosis. But the distinction here is that this is the story. We are in the story now. It's not a prologue. We aren't going to go to some other setting and do all the introductions. We're going to just move and let things unfold.
So can we talk about the difference between that and the inciting incident, for example? Because it may or may not be the inciting incident. The inciting incident may have happened off page and it's implicit. What are your views on that, Alida? I mean, my view is that you still need to know what's driven the hero what's propelled them into the story. There's got to be some big thing that does it for them, and usually that's on page. So in starting in media res doesn't mean that you leave the reader to figure out what on earth has made this story start.
Right. Okay. So not prepared, not scripted here, but let's take a stab at this problem, because that's a really great question, Robert. If you are starting in media res, then I'm going to say the inciting incident has already happened. What alters the course of Hamlet's life? The king is dead, right? That already happened. So we'll go back to the cancer patient. If you're getting chemo already, the thing that launched this journey through this cancer narrative is the diagnosis or the beginning of the symptoms. That has already happened. So part of the unfolding that we need to create for the reader is filling in that information. So you might have your character on the airplane or deboarding the airplane, and in the midst of this story, but maybe while sitting in the taxi, the character is recalling the phone call that started this journey, right? Your dad is dead, come home, right? Okay, now you have to go face your past. You have to go face your family. You have to go face your childhood traumas. So maybe that's the journey. That's the arc of the story. But the thing that launched that journey was Dad's death. Dad's death already happened.
Right. So would you say then that you would have maybe like I don't know whether you'd call it like a secondary inciting incident, but like in that example, maybe when they arrive at the house with the family, right? So Dad's dead is the inciting incident, but then you have kind of this moment where you get to know a little bit more, even though you've started in the middle, and then you arrive with the family. Would that feel kind of like a secondary inciting incident? Like here now we've launched into Act 2, or how would you structure that?
Good question. I think, I think it really depends on the story you're telling and what genre you're working in. You need to have dramatic tension driving the story forward, and what that looks like is going to be different from story to story. But if you have enough dramatic tension, you don't need another big bang, right? You don't need...
But it's like a shift, right? Another shift so that you can get from that act 1 to act 2. Because you're still going to have an act 1, even if your inciting incident is behind you. Yes? No?
I haven't thought about this before. You're making me go to new places, God, and speak publicly. What if I want to revise my answer later?
We'll do a second episode.
Yeah, okay. Alida's done research. Alida has answers. Well, yeah, if the inciting incident already occurred, do you still have an act 1? I suppose you do, but
it's just going to feel different, right?
Yeah, it's going to feel different. It's going to be structured differently. The acts in theater have a lot to do with set changes, right? So when you break, and in fiction, the acts have a lot to do with structuring the plot and creating these moments that propel us forward. So I don't have an answer yet.
I like this.
I have to think about this.
It changes the conversation from you started your story fast to you legitimately started in the middle of your story, right? Because there's a difference between there's conflict in sentence number 1, it's fast, I'm here, things are just going, blitz, versus legitimately the beginning of the story happened already. Right.
So let's play with the idea of Hamlet. I don't have a synopsis of Hamlet in front of me, so I'm not going to pretend to properly discuss Hamlet. But just for the sake of argument, let's say we've got a Hamlet-esque story. And the inciting incident is the king is dead. Hamlet's life is forever changed. So we open after the king's death, right? But now, how is Hamlet's life changed? Who does he need to become now that the king is no longer on the throne? And what is the plot? What's going to happen to him? Maybe somebody doesn't want him to ascend to the throne, and so maybe the inciting incident is that there's a political rival, or there's an assassination attempt, or there's, maybe he's in love with someone and that person is no longer acceptable because she won't be mature enough to be queen in time, or maybe, right? So what is the source of conflict now that this journey is underway? If we go back to the person sitting in the chemo chair, so now that the cancer journey is underway, what's happening? Maybe as a result of facing mortality, he realizes his life has been unfulfilling and he now wants to dissolve his marriage or something. So maybe that realization is the inciting incident, because now he's a person in the midst of a cancer journey who doesn't want to wait till the cancer journey is over to change everything that's wrong in his life. So maybe that becomes the next sort of springboard into our plot. Right.
It's a conflict that's going to shift what the protagonist has to do. So even though an inciting incident that may have kicked off the story is off page and behind, we still need something that acts as an inciting incident for the hero's arc within that particular story. And it may even be less dramatic than the thing that happened off page that allowed us to start in media res.
Right.
I'd also argue completely not completely the opposite, but it may not be the inciting incidents happen off page. We're just starting in the middle of some action, some conflict. So if you take my example of the couple arguing, so we open the story with them arguing, and she's frustrated. He leaves for work. She's stomping around the house, and then she finds something, that shows that actually he's been secretly conversing with some other woman for the last 2 months. Now that's changed. There's some new information that's could well be the inciting incident for what she then decides to do, that it's no longer about them having arguments all the time. What's the point in arguing with someone who won't even tell her the truth? So you can be starting in the middle of some conflict, but it isn't necessarily the middle of the story or even past the inciting incident yet. It's just that you're not spending ages setting the scene. So I think it can be both. I think clever stories can have a big inciting incident that's already happened off page, that's propelled the hero into where they are now. You're still going to need something that makes them have to change their, that sets up conflict that they have to overcome for the story to be a story.
Right. Have you guys seen, I think it's called A Marriage Story or Marriage Story? Adam Driver and Scarlett Johansson.
No, just the preview, but it made me want to watch it.
Yeah, it's worth watching. It's definitely character driven and quieter, but really good, and very dramatic and really well acted. But so it's been some months since I saw it, but you open with them telling a marriage counselor what they love about each other, but it's the story of their divorce. So you open, and it plays with time as well, where you learn about, you see all the horribleness of going through a divorce, right? And that is the forward movement. And you open in the middle of this kind of dissolution, like, what are we doing? But you know that they love each other as well, or they have in the past. And so there is all of this backfilling of who they were as a couple, why they got married in the first place, how they were good together for so many years. And so you open with them, the marriage is crumbling, they are getting a divorce, and you fill in the love piece, the marriage piece, right, as you move forward, instead of starting with, here's a happy couple, and now their happiness is ending, and now their marriage is dissolving, right?
Yeah, there you go. Good example of how it can be done in a more relationship, character-driven arc as well. Right. All right. Because if you look at, if we stretched it back the other way, I mean, if you start too early in the story, you're going to bore the reader with, you're going to be 2/3 through the book before you get to an inciting incident. So it's not necessarily just about starting in action. It's also about starting in the right place in the story.
Exactly.
So they are two separate things, I think.
They are, yeah. And, just thinking about The Marriage Story, it's a movie about getting a divorce, going through a divorce. So we have to ask ourselves, what is the story about? And let's say we were writing that novel about going through a divorce, then that's what your story is about. It's about getting a divorce. So you need to know what their marriage was like. You need to know how they fell in love and why they got married and how they were great parents together. You need to know all of that stuff, but you don't start your story back 10 years. You start your story with them getting the divorce, because that's what it's about.
What it's about.
And then you layer in to the divorce story these elements from the past as they are relevant and as they help us to have context for what they're going through now.
Ta-da.
Ta-da, lots of nodding. All right, any final thoughts, or is that it? I guess we're done. We're done with In Media Res. Thank you for listening to the StoryWorks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.